right, let's take a look at Module 6, where we're going to be dealing with steps 3 through 5 of the hacking cycle in system hacking. So system hacking covers gaining access, maintaining access, and covering tracks. Everything we've collected in the previous modules is now going to be leveraged to find a vulnerability and a way to gain access to the system, potentially escalate privileges, maintain access, and then cover up any evidence of compromise, oftentimes through the clearing of log files. All right, so there's two basic ways to gain access to a system and a bunch of subcategories within. One is to crack user passwords, and the other is to exploit system vulnerabilities, which lots of possibilities around that. When you log into a system using type 1 authentication, which is, by the way, the weakest type of authentication we have. Type 1, something I know. Type 2, something I have. Type 3, something I am. We should use at least two-factor authentication because passwords in the grand scheme of things are horrendously insecure, usually due to user error. So we'll talk more about that here in a bit. But if I'm going to verify that the password a user has just typed in is correct, that means the password to verify the match against has to be stored somewhere on the box, which then starts the whole thought process of, well, why wouldn't attackers just go after the password storage, compromise the stored password, and then use that to gain access to the system? And the answer to that is they would. So we make passwords on the system difficult to retrieve through a protected location and the fact they're encrypted with non-reversible encryption. They're password hashes. So the password hash can't be immediately reused. You have to crack the hash, which can't be directly reversed. It has to be recreated over and over and over again until you get a match by running password candidates or attempts through the known algorithm. The resultant output is matched against the hash. If it matches up, ding, 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 I'm in. If it doesn't, I'm on to the next attempt. So that can be incredibly time consuming, but definitely possible. So the password storage locations on Windows systems for non-domain controllers is the SAM database found in the System32 config directory. There's also the ntds-dit file, which is the storage location on an Active Directory domain controller. In Linux systems, it's typically a file called shadow. Now there's a password, PASSWD, and a shadow file. The password file contains user accounts. The shadow file contains the hashes. Within the NT family of operating systems authentication options, you have NTLM, which consists of NTLM and LM, which is outdated and insecure. We'll talk about that. And then Kerberos authentication, which has been around since Windows 2000 came out, which is a much more secure way to authenticate users. We'll talk about why that is, but there is a possibility of falling back to NTLM if Kerberos won't work for whatever reason. So when we crack passwords, we're trying to guess at the correct password until we happen to match the resultant hash output. All right, so that's what users and user relative identifiers and password hashes look like in the SAM file, which is again in the System32 config directory. It's one of the registry files. So I don't know what this is. I have to figure out what I run through the hash algorithm to actually produce that. LM hashes have been disabled in Windows, Vista, and later operating systems because it's a really, really weak form of encryption. I'll talk about that when we show examples of work factor for performing rule-based brute force attacks. All right, so I retrieve this file. I retrieve the hashed passwords in the file, and then I go through a trial and error process until I can produce the same hash. So the NTLM authentication process and Kerberos, let's talk through those, and then I'm going to show you a password crack against a locally captured password from the SAM file, and I'll show you one through an NTLM authentication. Actually, before we do that, let's go ahead and set the stage for it. All right, on my server 2019 machine, I'm going to fire up a oldie but a goodie, the Kane password cracking utility. It's actually a multifaceted security tool, but in this capacity, we're going to be looking at password cracking. I'm going to go to the Cracker tab, and I'm going to dump password hashes from the local system. I'm using a dump from the live registry option. I'm not going to worry about password history hashes right now. I can import from local system, from a text file, or from a captured SAM database, which the captured SAM database is encrypted using RC4 128-bit. So you'd have to have the decryption key for it as well. I'm going to click next. And since I've got system admin privileges, I can dump those passwords. Now, a little bit later on, we're going to talk about privilege escalation. So if I compromise a box using an average user account without admin privileges, I will not be able to dump password hashes. I'll have to escalate my privilege, but we'll get to that here in a bit. All right, so this is my password hash for JSON. This is my password hash for the administrator accounts. Now, we're typically going to know what the algorithms used to store the passwords are. That adheres to something called Kirchhoff's principle. We know how it's done mathematically. We just don't know what the actual password is. So we can run our password candidates or attempts through that process over and over and over again until ding, 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 we just happen to match that same 32-character hexadecimal hash. All right, so the ways we go about doing that are dictionaries, hybrid brute force attacks. We're going to hold off on that, or rainbow tables. We'll hold off on that for a second until we get to the corresponding slides. So that's a locally dumped password file, which I can then directly crack the captured hashes. There's also capturing online authentications or communication dialogues across the network. The NTLM authentication process prevents password hashes from being immediately replayed and reused by incorporating a challenge response mechanism into the process. So in a nutshell, when Sheila goes to log in to the domain controller, she sends her name. The domain controller sends back a challenge that is going to be matched against her submitted username and password. That challenge string is 64 bits of data, which is unique every time. You're not going to see the same challenge twice. All right, the attacker eavesdropping on all this, okay, can definitely sniff the exchange, but they can't immediately replay it as if it was just a transmitted password hash. Since the challenge string is unique to every authentication attempt, Sheila's challenge response back is actually a combination of her password hash plus the challenge equals the challenge response. It's actually hashed as well. So the attacker can't just replay that in a subsequent login attempt because they'll get a different challenge string every time. So challenge handshake prevents replay attacks by incorporating a unique challenge string every time. So it protects the user's password and the replaying of the password since each dialogue will be unique. But I can still capture that and I can still attack it. So let's see that in action. All right, if I turn on my sniffer, and I log in, from another machine. Now, we're going to fill in some blanks on this here when we get to the sniffers module. But for now, let's just say I'm on a hub network and I can sniff an authentication dialog. I'm going to log into the victim $sign account, put in my username and password, and I just authenticated to the admin share. On my Canebox 2019, I've captured a server message block protocol login with a successful result. Now I can send that to the cracker to be cracked alongside my dumped password hashes. So if I was to select NTLM-v2 hashes, I can crack that just like a locally dumped password hash, but we haven't done that yet, so we're going to come back to it. Okay, Kerberos, on the other hand, is much more secure in the fact that your password never crosses the network, just things encrypted with the password, which you don't know what they are to begin with. So you have an unknown encrypted with an unknown. You would never even know that you've decrypted it intelligibly. Now, there's definitely more to this, but I'm going to simplify it. When you log in to a Kerberos key distribution center, i.e. domain controller, it runs two services, authentication server and ticket granting server. When I log in for the first time that business day, for example, typically 8 to 10 hour timeframes, I'm going to need to get a ticket granting ticket, which is my master authenticated ticket for an 8 to 10 hour duration. So I request from the authentication server a ticket granting ticket. My name is actually sent with the request. So the server looks me up in the database, sends back a TGT that's encrypted with my password. All right, that TGT's symmetric key information is unknown to a eavesdropper, like an attacker, and then it's encrypted with my password, which is held in memory. So Eric and password are held in memory. They never leave the machine, they can't be captured. The TGT is decrypted with my password stored in memory, and then it's replayed against a ticket granting server to request access to other resources. Each subsequent session ticket, or TGS, session ticket ST, or service ticket, has a unique symmetric key that's encrypted with my password and then the trust account password of the server, for example, that I'm gaining access to. Both unknown factors. So an attacker is not going to like that, because even if it intercepts any of these tickets, these encrypted symmetric keys, it doesn't know what they are to begin with. It's never going to know that it decrypted them correctly. So you have an unknown encrypted with an unknown. There's nothing to go on here. So that's the strength in Kerberos. And there's more to it than that, but that's the basics. Challenge handshake, I capture the challenge and the response, and I can guess at that password piece until I happen to match the response. And I'm going to do that here in just a second. So Kerberos, we've had that since Windows 2000. It's been around for decades, but you still see fallback to NTLM or even weaker forms of authentication if the Kerberos fails, potentially. Now that can be reconfigured in the domain policies, but by default, there's still a huge tendency to lean towards functionality, which is away from security. So if there's a problem, you got to get those systems talking. Let's fall back to something less secure, and you can negotiate down to a weaker form of encryption. All right, so now that we've discussed local password storage, NTLM, and Kerberos, let's go ahead and crack a couple passwords. Password cracking techniques are used to recover passwords from computer systems. Got it. Passwords can be guessed, lent, stolen, cracked, etc. They're the weakest form of authentication we have. They're an example of type 1, something I know authentication. Type 2 is something I have in my possession, like a smart card, RSA Secure ID token. And then type 3 is something I am, biometrics. So passwords, if I present a password, does that actually prove I am who I say I am? Not really. It's possible you're not Eric, you've stolen Eric's password, and you're authenticating as Eric, but you're not really Eric. So the weakest form of authentication we have, but the most widely used. So most of your password cracking techniques are successful because of weak or easily guessed passwords. So when people use something that's easy to remember, generally it has some sort of personal meaning to them, pets' names, birth dates, anniversary dates, and so forth. That kind of stuff can be recovered from social media sites and through footprint reconnaissance and social engineering. So password cracking is going to fall into non-electronic and electronic varieties, shoulder surfing, social engineering, and dumpster diving. We actually talked about these in our second module, right? Footprint and reconnaissance. Active online attacks, remember that active means I engage the target system actively. Dictionary brute forcing, rule-based, hash injection, bunch of different examples of that. Passive online means that I'm sniffing the password exchange, and I just did that. I didn't do anything active, but I sat back and took in the password challenge handshake. I used wire sniffing for that. Later on, we're going to talk about how hard that is on a switched network and why we need man in the middle and replay attacks to make that happen. And then an offline attack is where I take what I've captured online and I take it offline. I go out into the shed, the garage, the shop, whatever. I close the door and I go to work on that thing. There's nothing to stop me from trying in an offline attack. You don't get locked out after 3 invalid attempts. You can keep on trucking until you're successful. It just may take a gazillion years. So the strength in a password and its security is how resilient it is to brute forcing attacks. And that goes to length and complexity. I'm going to illustrate that here in a second. All right, so those are our basic categories. All right, social engineering, convincing people to reveal passwords. It is frightening how easy it is with the right pretext to get somebody talked into giving up their password over the phone. Doing pen tests all the time, social engineering, phishing attacks. Moths to a flame, my friends. All right, shoulder surfing. Somebody types in a password at the Starbucks, local coffee shop. You set up video recording equipment or with your 2 eyes. And then dumpster diving, again, jot things down on a scrap of paper, throw it in the trash. Sticky notes, things like that may contain passwords. All right, the dictionary, the brute force, and the rule-based attack. Okay, these are different ways you're going to feed the password cracker with the next password attempt. So in a nutshell, I need to figure out, say that the password hash I'm trying to crack is H99. Now that's a big, long 32 character hexadecimal string, but I'm not going to torture you with me drawing out 32 characters of hexadecimal hash every time we talk about hashing. So imagine H99 is a unique hash value. I need to figure out what will equal H99 when run through the hashing algorithm that is used by the target operating system. So for example, in a Windows operating system, we know the exact process the password is run through to produce the hash, and we just repeat that process over and over again with different candidate passwords from a source that's either automated or manual. Now, manual is going to go really, really slow. I'm going to tell you, is it Apple? Is it Banana? A word list or a dictionary file takes a word list, apple, banana, cat, dog, elephant, ferret, and so forth, and just takes each word one at a time. So apple, you run it through, produces hash 18 or 81 or whatever, doesn't match. Banana, hash 44, no match. Cat, hash 99, ding, 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 we got a match. Now, usually you're not going to get it in the first 3 attempts, but that's how it works. You will trial and error until you produce the right hash. Now, here's the scary thing. If you happen to produce a collision, which means a different password just happens to produce the same hash, that will authenticate you to the system like the real password. The system doesn't know what the password is. It just knows what the hash should be. So if you get a collision, you're in, even with the wrong password. Yep, it's called a birthday attack. Frightening, yeah. So we're supposed to use hash collision algorithms like SHA-2, SHA-3. What happens though if my password is not in the word list? Well, thanks for playing. Game over. What if the password was actually cat07? Well, cat07 is probably not in a dictionary list, but if I was to use a hybridization attack where I add random characters to each dictionary word, like apple 00, apple 01, 02, 03, 04, etc. And if I added 2-number randomization, I would increase the number of attempts, but I would catch variations on those dictionary-based passwords. So eventually I'd do cat 01, 02, 03, 04, 05, 06, 07, ding, 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 I got a match. I would catch variations. So hybrids add random data to the dictionary root words for the dictionary file. The dictionary attack will always be the quickest to run, shortest time frame, but also not guaranteed success, since if the password's not in the dictionary list, you're not going to guess right. Brute force attacks on the other end of the spectrum will try every possible combination of characters in a methodical manner. Is it A? Is it B? Is it C? Is it D? Is it AA? Is it AB? Is it AC? Is it AAA? Is it AAA? Is it AAB? And try every combination like rolling up an odometer in a car. You go through all the possible combinations. It's an exhaustive, brute force attack, but guaranteed to be successful eventually. It may be thousands of years from now, but eventually I'm going to guess right and I'm going to crack the password. So word list, pretty straightforward. Hybrid, add characters to word list. Brute force, every possible combination of characters one at a time. And then there's rainbow tables where you generate your hash tables ahead of time, which can save you time after the fact, because once you've created the table, you've got the password and the hash in a table, then you can instantly decrypt any passwords for which you've generated hashes. So let's say later on I save my work on this brute force or dictionary attack, and later on I need to attack or crack hash 44. Well, ding, 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 that's banana. I've got it in my rainbow table. That's a little bit more involved than that. Rainbow tables take as long to generate as it would be to crack the password in real time. They also take up tremendous amounts of space, potentially. They're also completely neutralized if you use second variables like salts or peppers. All right, so let's take a look at the password crack, the dictionary attack against Jason's account. I'm going to right-click, dictionary attack, NTLM hash. The dictionary file I'm going to add to the list, and Kane is good enough to include a word list for us in the installation directory. This has 306,706 passwords in it, and I will make short work of that dictionary file. I'll select it. I'll also choose different permutations of the password, as is, reverse it, double it up, lowercase to uppercase conversion, etc., 2-number hybrid brute force attack. All right, let's let it rip. I'm gonna hit start, and my new i9 box is way faster than my old boat anchor system that finally failed on me. I got the password QWERTY in a relatively short time, and I was rolling along at, let me go after Martin here real fast. I got the talking here and I didn't point out the key rate. All right, I'm rolling along at about 3.8 million, 4.0 million passwords per second. It didn't take me long to exhaust that word list. All right, Martin's password was Apple. Got it pretty quickly. So depending on where the password exists in the word list, if it's in the A's, it's probably get picked pretty quickly. All right, but what happens if we don't get the password in the word list attack? Well, then you move on to a brute force. So the administrator account, for example, is more complex. I'm going to brute force that with an NTLM hash. This is where rule-based configuration comes in. So I need to define a character set and a minimum and maximum length. Rule-based means I know something about the password requirements, and I program the cracker to only attempt passwords that match the rules. So minimum and maximum length of 1, that's just 94 characters. I'm going to crack that instantaneously, but it's not 1 character long, so I need to move on. 2 characters, 8,930 instant. 3 characters, 839,420 instant. 4 characters, 78,905,480. About 5 seconds. 6 characters, 77,365,508,562. That's going to take me about 6 minutes. Rocking 18 million passwords attempt per second. Password attempts per second. Up at 6 characters, now it's going to take me about 10 hours. Up at 7 characters, now it's going to take me about 41 days. Up at 8 characters, now it's going to take me about 10 years. So there's usually a substantial jump between 7 and 8 characters. but that's completely dependent on the processor power of the system doing the cracking. If you get multiple graphics cards going, multiple CPUs, you're going to reduce that work factor by increasing the key rate. So many hands make light work, my dad always said. If you can distribute that across multiple systems, you're going to expedite the cracking process. All right, so that's a dictionary, that's a brute force, and a hybrid type of attack. So eventually it's going to guess right. Ding, 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 you're going to get a match. All right, back to my NTLM hashes, which I can also crack even though it was challenge response. I'll do a dictionary attack, reset the dictionary file position, and click start. And notice this runs at about 20% of the key rate that I saw with a non-challenge handshake. There's just more math involved. So more math to do, the slower the key rate, but it will eventually get to password, which is what the password is, the P's in the word list, and eventually be successful. So let that cook for a second. And that describes dictionary, brute force, and rule-based attacks. All right, other types of attacks. A password spraying attack is where you target multiple user accounts simultaneously and crack the passwords using a small set of commonly used passwords. So instead of using the same user account for multiple password iterations, which gets you locked out in a live situation, you're going to rotate those user accounts and use password lists and try not to lock anyone out and try to get a match. So password spraying is where you're, again, blasting away multiple user accounts with commonly used passwords. Crack map exec is one example. And then the mask attack, and then you might hear credential stuffing used alongside the password spraying discussion. Credential stuffing is where I've captured a username and password from a website, a known set of authentication credentials, which we all do it. Come on, we all use the same username and password for at least 2 accounts. Come on, we do it. If that gets compromised, then you blast those credential pairs against random websites, hoping to get a match. That's called credential stuffing. All right, mask attack. Attackers recover passwords from hashes with a specific set of characters based on some information of the attacker. So Hashcat is a well-known password cracking utility. It does have a mask attack option. All right, password guessing. Right. So is it this? Is it this? Is it this? That sounds painfully slow. Your failure rate is high because typically after 1, 2, 3 and about attempts, you get locked out. Count lockouts, great mechanism for preventing online authentication attacks. Offline, however, nobody watching. So I was able to run through millions of possibilities and not get locked out. That's because I'm not logging into a live system. Default passwords, we mentioned this before. If you do a Google search for default passwords, there are websites dedicated to the cataloging of default passwords. Cert.net, datarecovery.com, by vendor and by product. So again, default configurations, definitely a vulnerability. All right, active online attacks, Trojans, spyware, and keyloggers, which we're going to have the full Trojan, spyware, and keylogger discussion in malware threats. We're going to introduce the concepts in this module, and we're going to talk a lot more about it in our next module, Module 7, which is a great extension of our initial discussion in system hacking. Keyloggers, log keystrokes, plain and simple. It's a certainty that sooner or later you're going to type in something sensitive to the keyboard, and a keylogger is there to capture your keystrokes. They're often implemented as a component of spyware or a Trojan, which we'll have the formal introduction and definition of tomorrow morning. So you get infected, that malware collects your keystrokes, hands it back to the attacker. Ooh, looky, here's some passwords. All right. They also typically collect local password files, stored credentials for websites, and a bunch of other stuff. Okay, a pass the hash attack is you don't have to crack the hash, you replay the hash. There's actually two ways to do this. One of them is to rewrite your authentication token after you've logged into a Windows machine. If I am logged on to a local box and another account with privilege is also logged on, and I have system level privilege, I can actually access utilities like the Windows Credential Editor. I can look at my authentication token and I can clone the username and password hash of another logged in account. I can then use that to present myself to other resources and move laterally through the network. The most classic utility for doing that has got to be Mimikatz, which we'll see referenced in later slides. But original credit goes to Hernan Ochoa with Core Security, who wrote the original Pass the Hash toolkit, 2 executables. One was called Who's There, and the other was called I Am. What do you think those do? Who's there? Who's logged in? Domain admin. I am domain admin. Rewrite your own session token. So Mimikatz, Pass the Hash toolkit. The other option is where you compromise a password hash and then you just append it to a challenge and hash it in an NTLM authentication. You don't have to crack the password, you just have to replay the hash. And that's definitely a weakness in NTLM, where you can just concatenate it and hash it and send it back as a response. All right, the other issues with capturing passwords typically revolve around the fact we use switch networks. In a switch network, I don't see anybody else's traffic. We'll have that full discussion in the sniffing module, but for now, suffice it to say, everybody's on their own dedicated port on a switch, and we don't see anybody else's traffic. So if I want to capture your password handshake, how am I going to do that if I can't see the exchange? So the answer to that often is man in the middle, replay and forwarding attacks, which again, we'll talk about that in module 8. LLMNR NBTNS poisoning is a way to spoof your identity to impersonate a server. So in a nutshell, when a broadcast is made for a host name resolution, NetBIOS name or host name LLMNR, then a broadcast says, hey, who's file server 1? And then file server 1 goes, oh, that's me. Here's my IP address. Connect to me. What's to stop an attacker from impersonating the response from file server 1? So, hey, who's file server 1? I am. Attacker jumps in, beats the legitimate response back, says this is my IP address, and now they're masquerading as or impersonating that file server. Now you send them a challenge, they send the challenge response, and you're now privy to the challenge handshake response, where otherwise you're not going to see it. So link local multicast name resolution is used as a replacement for broadcasts in IPv6 networks. NetBIOS over TCP/IP uses old school broadcasts. So any way you slice it, the responder tool will respond to requests for name resolution and falsify or impersonate the response, and then collect the challenge. You'll be doing a lab on LLMNR NBT poisoning using responder. Good stuff. All right, Kerberos passwords. Okay, we just got done talking about the fact that Kerberos exchanges are much more secure because there's really nothing to crack like the challenge handshake. So instead, you try to compromise tickets, session tickets from the KDC. So AS rep roasting or Kerber roasting is trying to crack the tickets themselves if they've been captured and turning those into an intelligible form. So the TGT should be, again, should be issued at the beginning of the workday, for example, and then that sits in your ticket cache for 8 to 10 hours. If I could compromise the victim's system and I could compromise that TGT, I could brute force it and try to turn certain fields into intelligible fields. Kerber roasting is going after a ticket granting service ticket, target service account, trying to crack the ticket to obtain the user's password. So both of these require access to the ticket, which oftentimes is done by compromising the system where the tickets reside. Mimikatz, the Pass the Hash toolkit utility, also has a pass the ticket attack. So on that one, Again, if I'm on the same system with another logged in account, I can take their Kerberos tickets, TGTs. I can then replay those as my own and impersonate just like a pass the hash. So Mimikatz does both pass the hash and pass the ticket. All right, wire sniffing. We're going to have the full wire sniffing discussion in Module 8, but we've already shown an example of that. Wire sniffing is meant to retrieve useful information off the wire. It typically involves something active in nature to accomplish sniffing in a switch network. So we will talk more about wire sniffing in Module 8. We'll come back to it. Oftentimes, though, wire sniffing is performed by implementing a man-in-the-middle attack. So the attacker fools the victim into thinking it's the server and vice versa, and sets up a man-in-the-middle or replay attack where the victim sends to the intermediary and it's forwarded on, and that gives the attacker the opportunity to intercept and then crack what's not directly readable, right? So clear text obviously would be immediately reusable. Anything that's sent as in encrypted form would have to be cracked. So there's plenty of examples of man-in-the-middle attacks, different layers of the OSI model. So we're going to talk about layer 2, layer 3, layer 7, impersonating access points. There's bunches of ways to do that. The rainbow table. So the rainbow table, remember my password crack using Kane, was going to take, 20 years to complete. But once I completed it, if I created that table and I held on to it, I could immediately decrypt anything created in that table. And I was thinking I actually left that open, but I didn't. So the rainbow table takes time and effort to generate and lots of storage space, but once you're done, instantly decrypts anything within the range that was used to generate the table. So time-space trade-off, lots of storage space. Rainbow tables that you download from the internet that are smaller footprints, 50 gig, things like that, are much more limited character sets or key spaces. And they're not ever comprehensive. You'll never find a rainbow table for all 127 characters in Windows Password. It would be monstrous and take eons to generate. Rainbow tables are also easily defeated by using salts or peppers, which are second values added to the password before it's run through the algorithm. So we mentioned rainbow tables, and then we kind of walk away from it for a while and come on back. But rainbow tables can be effective for like application password crackers, and again, anything where you're not using salts or peppers. Otherwise, you'd have to know the salt to actually create the table ahead of time, and salts have a tendency to be variable. For every password change, they get changed. All right, so rainbow tables, we're going to come back to when they talk about salts. All right, offline attacks, distributed network attacks. This is just getting multiple systems working on the same job. So a DNA attack involves multiple agents running in a coordinated fashion by a manager, and you just divvy up pieces of the key space to different agents, and they go to work on breaking it apart into smaller tasks and then running through their particular portion of the key space. The DNA manager manages the whole thing. When an agent has finished its piece of the pie, it trades it in for another, and the whole thing is coordinated centrally and distributed across multiple nodes. So that could be grid computing, parallel processing, cloud environments, etc. Graphics cards, again, are multiple cores, working in concert. All right, PWDump. Tools to extract password hashes typically are going to use one of two methods. There's the LSASS vulnerability method, and then there's dumping from the live registry. If you've seen one password dumping tool, you've seen them all: PWDump, FGDump, Kane, LoftCrack, RainbowCrack, etc., Mimikatz, all dump using these exploits or these techniques. Once they're dumped, the password hashes are cracked using a cracker, and we've seen how that works already. All right, these tools must be run with administrator privileges. Important note at the bottom of the slide. All right, RainbowCrack. Pretty famous. RainbowCrack was one of the first tools to generate rainbow tables and use them to crack passwords. Time memory trade-off algorithm to crack hashes. There are other Rainbow table generation utilities, without a doubt. Other notable password cracking tools, which again, if you've seen one, you've kind of seen them all. They all have dictionary, brute force, hybrid types of attacks, potentially, and you configure them pretty similarly, GUI or command line based. Okay, John the Ripper, definitely famous. Hashcat, really good stuff. THC Hydra and Medusa. Hydra is more for online password cracking. Hashcat and John the Ripper more for offline or cracking captured hashes. Secure Shell Brute Forcer, can't actually say I've ever used that one. But plenty of Hydra, plenty of John the Ripper, plenty of Hashcat, and Kane every time I teach a CH class. And then some. Still love Kane, which I'm going to clarify something here. Sometimes Kane gets bashed as being an old, dated tool. Well, a 66 Mustang is still a classic and still does the job. Kane is still monstrously effective. It's been around ever since I've been in IT or longer, so 20 years plus, and it still does a great job. So it's also one of the most inclusive tools in functionality in one toolkit, and you don't have an equivalent on Linux. So that's like one of the few scenarios where Windows has an advantage over Linux systems as far as available tools. So Kane, no matter what you've heard, it is still going strong, really powerful utility. You've already seen it in action. It's been established for quite some time. All right, salting is an extra value. Whenever you change anything about the password and you run it through the algorithm, you're going to completely change the hash. So salt makes it more difficult to reverse the hashes, defeats pre-computed hash attacks, since it's an unknown variable and unknown to the Rainbow table creator at the time of generation. Salting is a variable. Peppering is a fixed value within the algorithm. All right, so the same password would have different hashes due to the different salts. Now you can definitely still crack that by incorporating the salt into the algorithm if you were to capture the password file. All right, then we get to vulnerability exploitation, which we've already had this discussion to a degree. We did vulnerability analysis in the previous module. We looked at discovered vulnerabilities, and then we determined what exploits were available. And then we actually used the exploit to exploit the box. So with vulnerability exploitation, we've already had most of this discussion. Identify vulnerability, risk, capability, develop the exploit. A lot of times exploits are already developed. Select the method for delivering, local or remote, generate deliver payload, gain remote access. We already did it. Also, this local or remote, we didn't really spend a lot of time on that, but an exploit may require you have access to the box. It may be something that can be run due to an insecure listener. What we looked at in vulnerability analysis was network-based exploitation of vulnerabilities. We had an insecure RPC endpoint listener. We also mentioned that as time goes on, Windows OSs become more hardened against those types of attacks. It may not be possible at all, so I may need to perform a client-side exploit, get on the box, and then elevate privileges by executing the exploit locally. So your exploit sites, as we looked at in the last module, exploit database, CVE, okay, VulDB, vulnerability database, okay, vuldb.com. All right, the exploit DB is probably the most established. That's maintained by Offensive Security. Again, the CVE is the most established index or catalog of known vulnerabilities. All right, the buffer overflow. So this is one of the most classic types of vulnerabilities. It deals with a lack of validation of the length of user supplied input. In a nutshell, address spaces and restrictions are logically enforced by the security kernel. You don't get access to areas of memory that are off limits or restricted, but you may have access to physical memory spaces in close proximity. You may be able to flood that physical memory space with unexpected overly long input. Now, this can get really involved, and your lab on this is very detailed. So pay close attention to what you're typing in the lab. There's a possibility you're going to have to start all over again. It's like 170 steps. but it'll walk you through the identification and the exploitation of a buffer overflow. So in a nutshell, you have stack and heap-based buffer overflows, format string errors, and a couple other flavors. But the stack-based overflow is you're overriding the stack of a running process. In a nutshell, you're going to overwrite a return address pointer that points to malicious code that you've dropped onto the stack by exploiting another physical memory location that happens to be close to the stack location and floods into the stack location. It hijacks the stack or the workspace running under a more privileged security context, and you execute your malicious code by pushing the code into the stack or onto the stack and then overriding a return address pointer. Now, again, you're going to walk through this step by step in the lab, but I'm going to walk you through the basics of buffer overflow exploitation. And this is not something that you're going to be doing day in and day out. So actually finding buffer overflows and constructing an exploit is some pretty manual stuff. Not a daily driver type of activity, but we do definitely want to cover it. All right, heap-based overflows, a little bit different memory space. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the heap. We're going to be looking at a stack-based overflow in the lab, and the exploitation involves multiple steps. We actually have a 8-step process, which involves first performing spiking. Okay, in spiking, you're sending crafted packets to the server to make it crash. That helps to identify buffer overflow vulnerabilities in the target application. So if the thing crashes, it may be vulnerable. Then, and this is actually an examination of the Codenity debugger. Then fuzzing is sending unexpected input to the application, large amounts of data, so that it experiences the buffer overflow and overwrites the EIP register. All right, it helps to identify the number of bytes required to crash the server. In a nutshell, you got to figure out exactly how far you need to push to flood the buffer and overwrite the return address pointer. So it helps us to locate the extended instruction pointer register, which tells us where to inject malicious code. All right, then you identify the offset, which is, again, exactly where the EIP register is. And again, you're going to be doing all this in the lab. Then you will overwrite the EIP register with malicious shellcode. All right, identify whether it can be controlled or overwritten with malicious shellcode. You're going to send, and again, you're walking through all these screenshots. They're going to walk you through in a lab. All right, then identify bad characters. Before injecting the shellcode, identify bad characters that may cause issues with the shellcode. Identify the right module. Okay, attackers identify the module of the vulnerable server that lacks memory protection. A debugger can be used to analyze the memory space, and you're going to be using the debugger throughout the process. So you're going to attach the process to the debugger. That allows you to dump the memory space and allows you to see exactly what's happening in memory. All right, generate shellcode and gain access. The shellcode will be the payload. You're going to use the Metasploit framework Venom command to generate shellcode and inject it into the register. All right, and all ADBG is a debugger. And that will actually exploit the box. I felt like we had an extra step there. So again, you're going to walk through this step by step. It's by far and away the longest lab in the course, and it weighs in at like 170 steps. So grab some coffee before that one for sure. And plan on restarting it at least once. The first time I ran through that lab, not a developer by background, certainly don't do manual memory analysis. I had to do it twice before actually the third time was a charm. So pay close attention, read every line, type in everything as advertised, double check, and I'll mention this in the lab videos as well, but double check your input before you hit enter. All right, buffer overflow detection tools. The two primary tools that we use for code analysis are debuggers and disassemblers. Disassemblers will turn compiled code into assembly instructions. Debuggers actually show you the memory space that's being occupied by the process. All right, then we get into privilege escalation. Privilege escalation is where you either go up or you go sideways. Horizontal means you get the privileges of another user at the same level. Why would I ever care to have the privileges of another average user? Typically permissions oriented. Oh, got it. So Bob has access to some files I want access to. Administrators can dump password hashes and things like that. That's vertical privilege escalation. So typically when I think of escalation, I think up, but there's also going sideways, compromising another user account. So one is typically ability-based, vertical, and one is access or permissions-based, horizontal. All right, DLL hijacking, and there's several different privilege escalation options in your courseware. We're going to touch on a few. DLL hijacking is, since most Windows applications don't use the fully qualified path when loading an external DLL library, instead they search the directory from which they've been loaded. So if you can inject a malicious DLL in the application directory, you can actually subvert the application when it calls the DLL. So Robber and Powersploit can both be used to detect hijackable DLLs and perform hijacking on the target system. No labs for that one, but it definitely definitely warranted an explanation. All right, I've already seen privilege escalation by exploiting vulnerabilities. If you remember this right here, those are both running under system security context. It's a little bit garbled here, but if I have interpreter and interact with the interpreter shell and I get user ID, I'm on as system. All right, it doesn't get any better than that. All right, so I may have escalation at the time of exploitation, and I may have to actually run a privilege escalation after the fact by running an additional Metasploit payload or post-exploitation module. All right, dilib hijacking, same concept, but Mac OS versus Windows. Same concept, dilibs, DLLs. And then pivoting and relaying to hack external machines. Okay, pivoting and relaying are both moving through a intermediary initially compromised host. So in a nutshell, one is routing, one is port forwarding. You can look at it that way. But pivoting is, let's say I can't get to client 2 here directly. All right, shut down. But I can get to client 1, and then I can advance to client 2, and then I establish a reverse connection back to the attacker. That's pivoting. Same thing with relaying. But in relaying, you're using port forwarding rules to access the system, and again, you're kind of relaying the attack through it. Any way you slice it, it's like playing Hacker Frogger, moving from turtle shell to turtle shell, advancing on your target. All right, misconfigured network file system. You actually have a lab on this. You're going to use a misconfigured NFS share to gain root access to the target system. A misconfigured network file system can be used to deliver an exploit, paves the way for attackers to gain root level access through a regular user account or a low privilege user, and you can use it to sniff sensitive data and files passing through the internet and launch further attacks. You'll be running through a lab on that one. All right, bypassing user account control. Okay, one way to perform privilege escalation is to remove that UAC pop-up. Are you sure you want to run this? Requires administrator privileges. There are a couple different ways to disable UAC, but in a Windows environment, even if it's set to any option, attackers can abuse a few Windows applications to create privileges without triggering a UAC notification. All right, and then executing applications. So once you've got the privilege on the system you require, now it's time to execute applications, and that may be to preserve access, which is a backdoor. It may be to log keystrokes, gather additional information, spyware, gather additional information, or install crackers to crack other sets of credentials on the hacked box. So it really depends what you want to do at this stage, but once you've gained access, escalated privileges, first thing you want to do is maintain access, but if you don't care to revisit the system and you just want to grab some information, again, it's completely dependent on what you're setting out to do. But it would be a good idea to ensure you can continue to revisit the system. Our remote code execution techniques, there are various ways to execute code remotely. Exploitation, service execution through WMI controls, Windows remote management. You can use PS tools for that, but they're just ways to launch executables on the target system. A little bit later in some demos, we'll be using remote code execution. I'll do it through web applications. I'll also do it through command line and through SQL injection. And we'll actually use symbolic links to execute codes as well. So we'll see several examples of that throughout the course, actually in this module and in a couple later modules. All right, Dameware remote support. Well, that's a GUI, yeah, but it's still a remote code execution application. So remote administration tools in the hands of an attacker are hacking tools. Hands of administration, hands of an attacker, it's a hacking tool. Okay, same tool, different purpose, different degrees of ethics or permissions. All right, the concept of the keylogger. The keylogger comes in two basic flavors. You have physical or hardware-based keyloggers, and you have software. And in the software variety, you've got kernel mode or application mode and a couple other different subvariants. But the whole purpose of a keylogger is to capture keystrokes. So invariably, you're going to type in something sensitive on the keyboard, and the keylogger is going to be there to capture it and get that either through a network connection or through local retrieval to the attacker through a keylog file. Now, we're going to be looking at keyloggers in the form of spyware and as components installed in Trojans and backdoors. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a more detailed discussion of that in our next module, which deals with malware threats. So we're going to inject the keylogger into the target system, which can be in the form of a driver or an application. It's going to intercept keystrokes. They also have a tendency to capture things like stored credential files, web browser password files, things like that, chat histories and so forth, which put them more into the spyware category, incorporating a keylogger, a little bit more multifaceted. All right, Metasploit, amongst other cool functionality, definitely has a keylogger component. You use the keyscan start command and the keyscan dump command to perform post-exploitation key sniffing after your interpreter session has been established. And we'll be taking a look at that in some of our lab exercises. All right, hardware keyloggers. You can pick them up for 15, 20 bucks online. The more higher storage capacity tend to be a little bit more pricey. They come in USB, and they used to have PS2 flavors back in the day where we had PS2 mice and keyboards, but lots of examples of hardware keyloggers. And those are generally more stealthy because they get installed as a physical device, and there's really not much to detect. You'd have to physically inspect the system to identify the keylogger. I don't know about you, but I don't go crawling around under my desk looking at the back of my PC on a regular basis, especially in public locations, kiosk machines and hotel kiosk machines. Ripe for the pluck-in as far as embedding keyloggers. Not that I've ever done that, but I've stayed in lots of hotels over the years, and there's plenty of opportunity to sniff networks, impersonate guests, keylogger machines, install spyware, et cetera, et cetera. I've thought about it. Of course, I didn't do it. All right, so spyware in general, spies on your activities. The most basic flavor of spyware is a cookie, a tracking cookie. It records details about what you do when visiting certain websites. And if you ever noticed that you could be looking at something on Amazon and then 5 minutes later on another website, and you see the pop-up ad for the same thing you were just looking at, that's going to be a tracking cookie. Browser add-ons, piggyback software installation, drive-by download, masquerading as anti-spyware, which is usually more of a Trojan type of characteristic, and web browser vulnerability exploits are all ways for spyware to propagate. In general, it's going to record your activities, and we have a very cool lab you'll be running through with the SpyTech Spy Agent. So it'll show you all sorts of different aspects, and it's actually a little disconcerting that this stuff gets marketed out in the open as legitimate software. You can most definitely monitor your kids online. You can monitor your employees if you tell them to. So this stuff gets marketed for legitimate purposes, but invariably it's used for purposes other than prescribed. So lots of examples of spyware, PowerSpy, SpyTech Spy Agent, tons of other ones over the years. All right, the rootkit. Okay, the rootkit the term means kit to provide root access. It's originally indigenous to Linux operating systems, allowing you to maintain root access from a remote location or backdoor access. And then as they evolved, they became more stealthy. They conceal themselves on the system. And the whole idea is the rootkit tries to make itself undetectable while preserving access to the target system. So it may provide backdoor functionality, and it may just hide or cloak other system processes, registry keys, software objects, etc. So I'll show you an example of one that hides processes here in just a second. But the rootkit gets actually, the system gets infected or propagated pretty much the same way any other flavor of malware does. You can scan for and detect rootkits prior to it being dropped on the system. Once it's been dropped, it takes measures to hide itself from view. And if it's running as a kernel mode driver, which most rootkits are, it's actually patching the operating system. So just to show you an example, I'm gonna walk you through a direct kernel object manipulation using a 2003 rootkit called foo. So DKOM actually directly manipulates kernel objects. In this case, the process table or task manager view can be directly edited and remove a suspicious process from view. So here's an example of that. It's my Unicode directory traversal demonstration. All right, I'm going to start run calc. Calculator is now running on my desktop. And I know that if I view task manager, it shows me calc.exe. So I can see it in the process table. The rootkit, I'll open a command prompt, process hide 1008 and enter. And now the process disappears. All right, so no longer resident, nowhere to be found. Any process explorer, task list, any process table enumeration utility will come up blank on that. That's pretty powerful mojo. The only way to really determine that it's running is to do a memory dump and start parsing the process memory. That guy actually is not participating in network communications. We're going to revisit this in our malware threats module. I'm going to walk through some dynamic behavioral-based analysis, and I'll use a remote access Trojan. I'll rootkit it. Will they be able to identify it based on the fact it has a listening port? But if I view my software environment, I can actually see that it's running as a system driver. It's this msdirectx.sys file. Ooh, PSSD, I wonder what that is. Oh, there it is. msdirectx.sys, kernel driver running from a path other than the system 32 drivers folder, which is typically where they run. So that looks a little bit weird, running off the desktop. Get another one running here. Not sure what that is, PSSDK. You've never noticed that one before. I have to revisit that in our malware threats discussion. All right, so that's what a rootkit's going to look like. And especially nasty because it can hide processes from being detected. All right, there's also NTFS alternate data streams. So we're getting into the covering tracks phase, gaining access, maintaining access, covering tracks, the 3 hacking phases in the hacking cycle that we're covering in Module 6. So hiding data with a rootkit is possible. Hiding data with an NTFS alternate data stream is possible. Hiding data using steganography is possible. And then hiding malicious executables in another executable, we're going to call that wrapping. And we'll take a look at that in the next module. It'll look an awful lot like steganography, but the difference is an executable carrier file. So the alternate data stream, everything in NTFS is an attribute. This is a feature, not a flaw, in the NTFS file system. Alternate data streams allow me to create a secondary data attribute for the primary file, and that allows me to hide it from view. Casual detection. If you're looking for it, you're going to find it. So I've got an example here. Oh, there's my password crack, by the way, on my password exchange. So I've got a folder created. Get rid of all this here. Alternate data streams, and I'm going to get a shell and do a notepad, eric.txt. Create a new file. This is visible, period. Save the file, save. All right, if I do a dir here, I see that eric.txt is 16 bytes in size. All right, if I do a SHA hash of that file, I'm going to see that it is, in fact, 16 bytes in size. And there's my original SHA hash, ending in 800. Now I'm going to do a notepad eric.txt : hidden.txt and enter. And that's going to create the forked secondary data attribute. So that colon operator is the magic file fork indicator. Create a new file called hidden.txt. This is hidden. And replicate and create some bulk. All right. So we've added plenty of data to the file. I'll go ahead and close it and save it, and then rehash the file. All right, it's still 16 bytes in size. It still produces the same hash. Side by side. Okay, that doesn't appear to be right, but it only calculates the discharge and the hash for the primary data stream. If I do a dir, I see that it's still just 16 bytes in size. So where did that data go? It counted against the free space, but it didn't impact the file's discharge. If I do a notepad eric.txt : hidden.txt again, I'll call the file. But if I look at it in the directory view and I open it, I just see the payload. If I open this in a hex editor, oops, let's not do that yet. Come back to that. I want to put an executable in there as well. If I do a dir/r, that'll actually show me the alternate data streams. All right, so there it is. And if I'm looking for it, I'm going to find it. I can also put an executable, but I've got to manipulate it a bit to actually launch it. So I could do a type Windows, System32, calc.exe into eric.txt calc.exe, and I just put an executable in a hidden location. All right, now to call it, I have to do a symbolic link creation. Do backdoor.exe. Make sure my syntax is right there. Symbolic link created. All right, so now if I run backdoor, it launches calculator. So I can launch it from the hidden location. Now, again, if I do a dir/r, I'm going to see both of those alternate data streams. And it shows me the system link. It also shows me the path to the alternate data stream. If I look at it in a hex editor, I'll see the child objects because the hex editor is going to show me child objects. All right, so go to ADS. There's eric.txt. The ... says that it has child objects. And if I double click, it's going to ask me to explore. There's my calc.exe. There's my hidden.txt. And it still does some wacky stuff. It's not tracking the file again. Something funky is going on here. It's actually going to the root of the partition versus the file. That should show me something's wacky. I'm going to open that one more time. Second time's a charm. Open the partition. Some weird pathing errors as well. All right, ADS, eric.exe, explore, there's hidden. Still not displaying it. Interesting. Well, this is hidden, this is hidden, this is hidden. It's supposed to be showing up there, but it's not advancing. Weird. Some of the Google Drive file streaming thing that causes issues with that as well, but that doesn't make any sense on this one. So regardless, I see the alternate data stream, and if I'm looking for it, I'm going to find it. All right, so that is a little bit different than what we're going to see in steganography. We're hiding data inside the file system. How to create NTFS streams, I actually just ran through everything. So everything I just showed you in the demo actually maps these slides and the stream manipulation, and we did the backdoor after making the symbolic link. All right, steganography is putting a message inside of an obvious cover medium. So I'm going to put a message or a file inside of another file, and I'm not going to impact that file's functionality or viewability. So hiding something in a picture file, for example, is a classic scenario for steganography. I can then send the picture file out as an email attachment or an embedded object, and then the recipient can extract it, and it's typically encrypted as well, which means even if it's detected, it can't be extracted. So steganography is used for all sorts of things: hiding illegal content, contraband, covert messaging, data exfiltration. Steganography tools, Snow, a white space steganography tool, has been around forever, at least 2 decades. It allows you to put a message in the white space of a text file that actually shows up as extra space. If you were to highlight the whole thing, you'd see the blue lines over the white space, but you don't see any actual data there. And then you can extract it using the password in the receiving system. I'm going to show you an example of image steganography using a tool called Invisible Secrets, and then we'll extract it and detect it using a tool called Xsteg, which is a graphical front end for a command line utility called StegDetect. All right, so steganalysis is reversing the process of steganography. It's detecting a malicious payload or suspicious payload in an image file, and I'll show you an example of that here in just a second. One other steganography detection tool is Zsteg. All right, so now that I've covered the slides, let's do the demonstration, and I'm going to use a picture of my oldest Dudley, my oldest dog Dudley, and we're going to embed a malicious script inside a picture of my puppy Dudley. All right, so I'm going to bring the Dudley puppy out, the Xsteg utility out, Invisible Secrets, and a malicious DNS poisoning script, dnspoison.bat. Now, if we look at this, we're going to use this in our sniffers discussion to perform DNS poisoning of the internet variety. We're going to misconfigure our victim with a static DNS IP address that is an imposter server. All right, so I'm going to install Invisible Secrets and utilize the evaluation version. I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to hide a file. I'm going to add a file for my desktop, and we're going to select the dnspoison.bat file. I'm going to select a carrier file, which will be my image file, dudleypuppy.jpg. Next. Specify a password for the encryption. Select the encryption algorithm and enter a name for the file. We'll call this Stega, and hide the file. All right, so Stego, if I right click and look at the SHA hash and Dudley Puppy, if I right click and look at the SHA hash, they're definitely going to be different. All right, so I've got a payload, a size difference, 071 versus 263, and the hashes are definitely different. So there is a difference between the two files. All right, if I view both files in a hex editor, I'll also see a difference. So Stego has all this going on. Dudley Puppy does not. So that's the encrypted payload, and I don't see it. So when I compare and contrast, there's definitely differences. When I look at the files side by side, there is no difference. All right, so this is Dudley when he was 7 weeks old when I first got him. He's my oldest. He's going to be 14 here in a week, and he's still got the same look on his face. But there's no difference between the two files, right? No discernible difference. The file views just fine. When I open the file, it does not run the executable, which your brain wants to jump to, oh, wow, did it run the exploit as well? It doesn't, because the JPEG is not an executable file. Wrapping, however, which we're going to look at in the malware threats module, will execute. So they look almost identical, but one is encapsulation in an executable file, one is the encapsulation in a non-executable like a JPEG. All right, so that's the embedding, that's the analysis, and then I can also run a utility like XSteg, which is a graphical interface for Steg detect, which is command line, and I can open my newly created Stego file, and it'll register a detected signature for invisible secrets. All right, so ding, 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 ding. We detected an embedded signature, looks like invisible secrets. All right, but it won't extract it for me. So it identifies that it's there, but we still have to break the encryption and use the original tool to extract it. So steganography, even if it's detected, if it's secured with strong encryption, you're probably not getting to it. So that's another great way to hide information from being detected, use steganography. So we've got alternate data streams, we've got rootkits, we have steganography. All right, there's also maintaining persistence by abusing boot or logon auto start executions. So if I want to continue to revisit the system and I install a backdoor, I need that to restart every time the system boots. We'll talk more about auto runs in the malware threats module, but we have a lab you're going to complete on maintaining persistence by abusing boot or logon auto start executions. And typically those are embedded as registry keys or in the startup folder. So startup folder is kind of the classic location for auto starts. And then registry keys, there's dozens of those in the registry, which we'll take a closer look at in our malware threats model. All right, and then all of a sudden, kind of back to the Kerberos discussion. The golden ticket attack and the silver ticket attack refer to, golden is forging TGTs by compromising a key distribution service account, and then silver ticket is for the ticket granting service tickets or the session tickets. So both of those can actually be forged with Mimikatz. So those are revisiting our Kerberos attacks from earlier in the module. And then finally covering tracks. Step 5 of the hacking cycle is cleaning up any evidence of compromise. So there are a few ways to go about doing this. You can disable auditing, which turns off auditing, disables actual logging to the log file. There's clearing logs, nice, clean, empty log file, which might raise some suspicion. And then manipulating log files, selectively removing entries, which would be the most meticulous way to go about doing it. In the malware threats module, we'll talk about covering tracks in the network OS. Deleting files, hiding artifacts, and disabling Windows functionality are also options. All right, so imagine that I want to rob a bank and not get caught on tape doing it. What are my options? Turn off the cameras, rob the bank. Or rob the bank, go back and wipe the tapes. Or rob the bank, go back and wipe just the time sequences where I'm in there with the ski masks and stick them up. So disabling auditing, AuditPol is a native Windows system administration utility that allows you to administer the audit policy. All right, when you change the audit policy, that itself leaves an audit entry saying that the audit policy has been changed. So you can turn off auditing, or you can clear the log files completely, which looks a little bit suspicious, but better than having evidence left behind. There's a ton of log clearing utilities: dump.el, ELSave, PS log list, batch files like clear event viewer logs.bat. And then there's also the clear EV command in Meterpreter that's real handy since it's already built into Metasploit. So for example, let's hit my 2003 box here. Actually, let's go after my 2008 box. Go to Event Viewer, go to the Windows logs, application. All right, so I've got application, I've got setup, I've got system, I've got security. Now I've got that 2008 box compromised. I'm going to right click, get myself a Meterpreter shell, and I'll do a clear EV to clear the event logs. All right, wiping. Now I go back and visit, and if I do a refresh, it confirmed, but let's do this. Back up. Well, that's interesting. Refresh. No, confirmed, but it didn't run. That is interesting. All right, well, let's go ahead. This is a 2008 box. Didn't get confirmed though. All right, let's blast the 2003 then. I've never seen that fail when it confirms before. That's interesting. All right, Meterpreter, clear EV, bam. Did I run that against the... Get user ID. The wrong box? Maybe. Looks like it got misdirected. All right, let's hop over to 2003. All right, empty. All right, one more time, just so we see it in real time. All right, there's my application. Let's go ahead and compromise this guy. All right, Meterpreter shell. Clear EV, bam. All right, now refresh, empty. That 2008's got me intrigued though. Let me go back and revisit that one. All right, so it can be that simple, or you can, of course, like anything else, use PowerShell for it. So whenever anybody asks you, can you do this in PowerShell, just go ahead and say yes, because you can do it somehow, some way. PowerShell, monstrously powerful command line interface. You can definitely clear event logs using PowerShell. A lot of emphasis on the use of PowerShell since it's a living off the land type of tool. It allows you to use a very powerful native system utility to perform nefarious activities. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about fileless malware in our malware threats discussion. I can also manually clear the event logs. Right click, say clear log files. In Linux, the var log folder contains most of the log files in a text file format. So all you really need is a text editor and the ability to manipulate the log files. There's also going in and removing, and we get into this way more in forensics, but Windows tracks all sorts of stuff about what you do on that box. Command histories, most recently used, URL histories, it's all there. It's just a matter of digging in and extracting it. So clearing online tracks, most recently used, cookies, cache, and so forth, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Using a multifaceted tracks clearing utility is recommended, like a CC cleaner, window washer, bleach bit, that sort of thing. All right, then your bash shell tracks, the command history in a Linux bash shell is ongoing. The command history in a Windows terminal window, command prompt window, goes away the second you close the window. So the DOS key history command in Windows is pretty useless if the terminal window has been closed. In Linux, the history file is ongoing and keeps getting appended to session after session. There's my history. And I could clear that, or I could set it to not record X number. History size is 0, not record anything. But when you delete or clear those history files, the actual data is still there waiting to be forensically retrieved. So instead, you can use shred or cat null commands to go through and purposefully overwrite that information. So this is more of a discussion for the CHFI forensics class, but something that's deleted is not deleted. It's just marked as you may overwrite if you like, and we wait around until it's actually overwritten. So lots of opportunity for forensically retrieving deleted data. But you got to come back for CHFI for that. All right, covering tracks on the network, we're going to address covert channels in our malware threats discussion, but the idea here is to obscure your communications across the network if you're remotely interacting with a compromised host. Reverse HTTP shells, ICMP tunnels, these are great ways to get a connection back out of the network, but I'm going to diagram it, whiteboard it, talk about it in our Trojan discussion tomorrow. DNS tunneling, TCP parameters are both options as well. And then covering tracks in the OS, the alternate data streams we talked about. Unix and Linux, you can append dots to files, which just hides the files. Export history size to 0, modifies the history file. And then Cypher.exe is actually for managing encrypted file system under the Windows NTFS file system. I did not know until CH version 11 came out that it has a function for overwriting deleted files. And it does it through a multi-pass zeroization and random overwrite. So Cypher /w drive letter goes through, identifies deleted files, and removes them. Otherwise, deleted files are far from deleted. All right, other options for hiding artifacts. Most of this is standard, making the hidden file hidden, an attribute, adding the dot. So hiding files and folders in Windows, set the attrib command. You can hide user accounts using registry keys, and then hiding files and folders in Linux. Again, you add a dot to the beginning of the file, and then it has to be told directly to show hidden files. So those are all ways for evading casual detection. All right, track covering tools. CC Cleaner had some malware in it not too long ago. But these types of utilities will very targeted and very focused, purposefully delete most recently used, command histories, things like that. Privacy Eraser, Wipe, BleachBit, ClearProg, all examples of track covering tools. All right, now we've got more on that topic in the malware threats module, which is coming up next. But that completes our discussion of system hacking, at least for the time being. We talked about gaining access, escalating privileges, maintaining access, executing applications, and finally covering tracks. So we got lots of cool labs for you for this module. And some of these topics that we introduced today, we're going to continue in the next module. And we did table some other items for later discussion, specifically around sniffing, which we'll talk about in the sniffing module. So that concludes our lecture for Module 6. Enjoy the labs.